Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for this week's GES seminar. I'm Andy Miller. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems. Before we get to the introductions, I'm just going to share my screen for a moment so that you can see our seminar presentation coming up next week. The title is Debt Justice. Hopefully this is not in the way. Debt Justice for Climate Reparations, going to be presented by Patrick Bigger, who's Senior Policy Fellow at the Climate and Community Project. So we'll be sending out an announcement about that as soon as we're done today. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over now to Selena Gibson, who's one of our graduate students in the department, and she is going to introduce Dr. Susan Sterett, our speaker.
Thank you.
Dr. Susan Sterett is a professor in public policy at UMBC. She writes on disasters and legal mobilization with a focus on climate change. She currently has a manuscript under review at the University of Pennsylvania Press concerning litigation, the first part of a pandemic, entitled Disaster Cascades in Court. Before joining UMBC in 2017, she worked at Virginia Tech, at the National Science Foundation, and the University of Denver. She has organized seminars on disasters and climate change at the International Institute for the Sociology of Law in Spain. She has written on legal mobilization and disaster, published in Law and Policy and Natural Hazards Review. She has also served as a co-editor of Law and Society Review.
Okay, thank you, Selena, and thank you so much to Andy Miller for inviting me to present, and thank you as well to all of you who are coming. I recognize that we have a dean's candidate meeting right now, and the conflict is pretty much unavoidable. I'm grateful that I've been able to see the other ones. So I decided that what I'm going to do is give something of an overview of my research agenda and perspective, which raises some questions about how we study climate, how we think about displacement, and the kinds of data that we use. And given that there are lots of conversations about data these days, I'm hoping that that can be useful to people across multiple fields and perspectives. So let's see, these two pictures. Oh, one other thing that I want to note, for whatever reason, the text box feature stopped working for me in PowerPoint. I don't know why. And so I don't credit everybody's pictures in this, but and I feel bad about that. I think that's bad karma. So I will happily share anything with anyone. If you want to know, these two pictures are mine. My family lives in Sonoma County, California, which and has lived there for a very long time, which has experienced severe fires in recent years. Curiously, that's not actually how I came to disasters. So the picture that says Sonoma Strong is from the Windsor Green, the Windsor Town Green, where after the Tufts fire, they've just suffered repeated fires in the area and repeated evacuations. And they have been thanking first responders. So that's what this is on the Windsor Green, and the hashtag has been Sonoma Strong for that. I had my cousin's kids, so first cousins once removed, I've learned to say, made t-shirts with Sonoma Strong as a fundraiser. This is a picture from the Mayacama Mountains in Santa Rosa, California. The trunks are burned. You may not be able to see in the light. And the growth is new spring growth. It's from last May, when we could first travel to see family, or I could first travel to see family anyway, in the pandemic. So anyway, that sets a little bit of context, although again, curiously, it's not how I came to studying disasters. Okay, I'm going to try and talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and I hope with any luck answer questions after that, but I'm happy to keep talking because I've got a lot of stuff in play. And let's see, my screen does not want to advance. There we go. Okay, so first what I'm going to do is give a feel for what I do, because I think it's highly relevant in the climate world, including in some of the climate discussions, and yet it's not a field that people routinely talk about for reasons I don't really know. It's considered something of a subspecialty. So I work in legal mobilization, which is not what the rules are, but how claims come before court and who comes before courts. And that includes legal opportunity structures, who can bring cases to court and who might have incentives to bring cases to court. And there's been a lot of scholarship in this field debating whether or not courts can fix problems, with, roughly speaking, a general consensus being that they don't, but they do a not bad job of revealing problems, organizing, contributing to organizing problems, sometimes inspiring people and mobilizing people. And sometimes, as the Science, Technology, and Society and legal mobilization scholar Sheila Jasanoff says, that they operate between fact-finding and meaning-making, that they keep something of a public record as well of decisions generally, but not exclusively framed as stories. Why do courts not usually count as problem-solving mechanisms? The framework from someone named Jerry Rosenberg names it. It's a long-standing perspective, but Jerry named it as constrained courts. That the old line from the Federalist Papers in the United States is they have neither sword nor army. The legal anthropologist Sally Falk Moore noted that courts don't actually come from outside the power structures that they're judging, they come from inside them. And that means that the same forces that apply to mobilize or creating the problem are going to be there as you might try to address it. And another way of thinking about it as well that I want to add is that I pay attention to settlements rather than decisions. A lot of what are called sociolegal scholars, which is the field I'm within, take a look at how cases settle, that is the agreement that people might reach, rather than waiting for a judge to decide cases. That is the primary mode of relying on courts to address issues. And yet in political science anyway, much of the scholarship is around coding outcomes in courts. And we can see that, and it's not that it's wrong, it's just there's other stuff to look at. We can see an artifact of that or an echo of that in all the attention we give to the United States Supreme Court. They don't hear most cases, and yet they're the ones that we pay attention to. And appointments to the United States Supreme Court have something of a celebrity status now too, which is part of it. It didn't used to, but also we tend to believe that what they say goes. Okay, I got into this by looking at claims against the Federal Emergency Management Administration after Katrina. And I looked at claims against FEMA and insurance claims post-Katrina for wind and water damage. Short story is insurance companies said that wind damage was covered, but water damage was not. And so the big money fight was over whether your house was damaged by wind and water. I'm not exactly sure in the middle of a hurricane you count that particularly, but it ended up being a big money question. And one of the things I want to illustrate about the importance of thinking about this issue is a timeline that's up on the screen from the very first cases brought after Hurricane Katrina, the very first one being McWaters versus FEMA, brought in early December when FEMA was threatening to close down housing, basically, for all the people who had been displaced after Hurricane Katrina. Not politically a great look in December, and people had thought they were going to get housing for a year. But the main thing that I want you to note is that these cases went on until 2010, first of all, and secondly, there were multiple decisions. So early decisions could get a lot of press. The early decision to McWaters, FEMA can be sued, was very big news, but these cases petered out much later on and do not get the same national press coverage. Okay, so I want to do a little more advertising of what I do as a field rather than necessarily my work all by itself, but I'm talking about that as well. Okay, I have an article forthcoming with my graduate assistant or former graduate assistants, Laura Madison, who did that timeline that I talked about, that maps the different kinds of climate change questions, not relying on a database, which I'm going to get to, but the different kinds of claims that people have argued are part of climate change. And this wonderful English legal scholar named Kim Bauer has argued that she's summarized that over and over people search for a Holy Grail. And when I was grabbing that picture, I don't think about Holy Grails that much. If anything, it makes me think of Monty Python. but I hadn't thought so much about how it's very much a Christian iconography. But the idea that there is one thing that will fix all our problems and indeed has magical properties. And so she argues that there has been a big search for claims against oil companies in particular as a holy grail that will solve all climate problems. The other kinds of claims that have become prominent are human rights claims, and that includes around the UN's guiding principles on internal displacement. They're guiding principles because they are not binding law. They were initially issued in 1998, but they get a lot of press, and a rapporteur for them, Walter Kalin, has written a whole lot of letters about the promise, or articles about the promise of the guiding principles on internal displacement, which frames internal displacement as a matter of rights. And one of the rights that people have, including a right to choose to return or not, is a right of judicial review. So again, we see this kind of centrality of images of courts. And we see that in the sciences, there's a lot of hope for attributing climate change to fossil fuel companies and attributing disasters, and that will solve the litigation problem, that the litigation problem for fixing all of climate change, for finding those Holy Grail cases, is just a question of being able to attribute disasters now to a changing climate. And so this article from Nature Geoscience from 2017 argues that we're getting closer in being able to attribute disasters to a changing climate. And I want to note that there are other scientists who said it's simply the wrong question, that that damage and disaster is a result of multiple factors, as we can all imagine, and that we can think of a changing climate as exacerbating damage. But nevertheless, including in natural science journals, what we see is this link to a hope for litigation that will solve all problems. Okay. And people do seem to think that they will solve all problems. I'm just going to draw on a couple of high-profile cases that have come out, have gotten a lot of press in recent years. One is from our Children's Trust, the Juliana case. This is from their website, on the idea that articulating a human right, a legal right to a safe climate, borrowing from a common law doctrine that land is held in a public trust, which actually has been used throughout the 19th century to give land to railroads, basically, but I digress. But anyway, a woman in Oregon was a law professor who's been very entrepreneurial and very good at using our Children's Trust image that we hold environmental goods for the future, and that therefore there's a legal right for children to a safe climate, has gotten a whole lot of press, and it continues to work its way through courts, including, for example, with a very quotable decision from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, federal court, basically saying this case can't go forward, but it should be able to. There are also similarly, so framing around children has been really important in high-profile cases. There are cases brought against 33 countries in the European courts over climate change, begun by children in Portugal. And this is from the newspaper The Guardian, again, for climate-related disasters, rather than necessarily only climate change. And I don't read as much science fiction as a lot of climate people do, but I do read some. So imagine my surprise, I did not plan this, is doing a double take, is reading the prominent science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, The Ministry for the Future, where he does imagine a future where we are protecting the climate in multiple dimensions and taking many adaptive actions. And one of the background characters throughout it is not the main point of the story, is basically we can't wait until the courts fix this case for the future and then all our problems will be solved. And I really admire Kim Stanley Robinson. He gets out a lot of work on social science in his fiction. So I just want to note this is a dominant trope. And if it mobilizes people, great. I'm not disagreeing with it particularly. Okay, but what counts as climate change litigation? Certainly there's the big stuff, attributing disasters to a changing climate. There are a lot of cases working their way through the courts. The Supreme Court is going to be addressing one now. The oil companies are fighting them pretty hard. Some of the fights are not particularly inspiring about whether they belong in state or federal court, but it's hard to organize people around that kind of language, but that is very high stakes in the litigation. Many people who study climate litigation not only study the very high profile news cases or cases that make the news, such as the Our Children's Trust case or the case in Europe, but cases that are deliberately brought by environmental litigators who identify themselves as working on environmental issues, so framed as environmental issues. And wonderful scholars work from the Sabin Center database out of Columbia University. And they draw on cases that mention climate change in one way or another. And it's a searchable database, very usable. Many scholars use it. And they have aggregated in a way that is really admirable because cases usually have multiple iterations and it can be hard to figure out how to group them. And they've grouped them in families of cases, which I think is extremely well done. They do define what they count as climate change litigation. And so I grabbed this also from the Sabin Center website. It must be a material issue of law or fact. So passing reference to climate change won't do it. So somebody's coding them, and I didn't look up who does the coding, as what counts as a material issue of law or fact. Cases that may affect climate change in one way or another, or might be implicated in issues related to climate change, but don't raise climate issues, are not included. So you're going to see that the database, which again, God bless them for putting it together. They've got funding from a corporate law firm, Arnold and Porter. I can't say enough how much I admire it and how useful it is for people. I just want to note that it shapes climate litigation in a particular direction, that it is stuff that environmental lawyers would recognize. And my slide advancer is only sometimes working. There we go. Okay, so in a lot of the documents that we see a conclusion around climate change that people will have to move. And that includes in the United States report. I'm shifting gears here now to talk about displacement and incentives. I also want to hold on to an idea that I might well want to define litigation much more broadly than the Sabin Center does. Again, remember insurance cases out of New Orleans, remember cases against FEMA. Okay, so conclusion from authoritative documents and in international negotiations is that people will have to move largely as a result of sea level rise. And the scholar Andrea Simonelli at VCU has a really nice book on displacement and climate change. And she really notes the outsized attention on disappearing islands. And I was really grateful that she noted that, because otherwise I felt like I was going to have someone code that, because it's remarkable. Ile de Saint-Jean-Charles, there's a picture of this from NRDC in the lower part of the screen right here. By the time it got federal money to relocate it, which it did get, and that's widely been celebrated as a victory in climate relocation, climate-related relocation, had about 80 inhabitants. It was a very small community that had certainly been suffering from a changing climate, in addition suffering from a long history of how Native American peoples have been treated in this country. Another longstanding sort of marker for areas in the United States that will have to relocate include a couple of villages in Alaska. This is from NOAA, and this is from the village Shishmaref. Kivalina has also been mentioned frequently. And Shishmaref, people have been well aware that the oceans have been eroding what they're up to in that area and being able to live there, and they will have to relocate. But again, this outsized attention on disappearing islands implies that everybody's in the same situation. Everyone will leave at once. Why? Because the land will disappear. That is, there are no complex decisions to make. I mean, it's complicated to facilitate people moving and to pay for it. It's expensive, but we're talking very small populations of very cohesive communities that often occupy a position in the American imaginary as places with people who are particularly disadvantaged because of histories of disenfranchisement disenfranchisement, whether as Native peoples in the lower 48 or Native peoples in Alaska. Okay, so again, imagine cohesive communities, small populations, land will disappear, and that everyone will leave. Okay, then the problem becomes, why won't they move? And I hope you can hear my tone of voice. I just don't love that question. It tends to, and this is from Deborah Haveline, I believe she says her surname, who is a leading political scientist who has mapped a research agenda for political science, and she would locate the decision to move or not as a matter of individual attitudes. She notes in an overview article, and she's just a convenient foil. Again, God bless her for paying attention to it. It helps to set up a different kind of research agenda. I'm not faulting anyone. A lot of political science tends to look at individual attitudes. And so she was noting that we need survey data about people's attitudes about home or wanting to leave. And I would argue that we might want to think about institutions, institutional incentives, and histories that people have to understand decision making, and that we might actually even both want to look at those incentives, what I'll get to in a minute, and also probably talk to people, which I did put in the abstract for this. So we could really reframe the problem instead of why won't they move when all the sensible science says they're going to have to move, to understanding the settings that people live in and the complex environment of decisions. These two pictures are from a government accountability report project from 2020. It was a pilot program on relocating people from different communities in the Midwest that have suffered severe flooding, in Alaska that suffer sea level rise, and then in Santa Rosa, California, where again my family's lived for a long time, in the Coffee Park neighborhood where my family did not live, which was utterly devastated in the October 2017 wildfire, and where people evacuated from. Below is a picture of rebuilding. People are not all leaving. And I, just as a quick flag, again, my family does not live in Coffee Park, but I joined UMBC in late August 2017, and I was pulling up early in the morning, October 2017, and I got a text from my mom saying, "I'm okay." I thought, now, why would I not think you're okay? And that's when I looked up and found out more about the fire overnight. So you could look in particular settings in the complex environment of decisions. First, it's worth noting that some do leave. Second, we can think about a discounted future and substantial uncertainty. It's very, and again, I haven't talked to people about this either, just not as a systematic research issue. This is a gossip question. But if you've been burned out this much this year, are you actually really going to be burned out again? But so people discount the future and have substantial uncertainty about whether they're going to get burned out again. Since 2017, there have been enough fires and enough evacuations, people have begun to suspect they will. But even more than that, I want to add that what we could start thinking about is the incentives that keep people where they are. So we can think about the insurance payments and homeownership that can give homeowners a greater opportunity to choose what it is they're going to do, whether they're going to take opportunities to leave or whether they are going to rebuild where they are if their insurance and zoning will allow it. On the idea that we want to, and again, this is more research agenda than anything systematic that I've got right now, but on the idea that we want to think about incentives and settings, we want to think about local governments and reasons that they want to hold on to property holders. I leave it at that. That is, they don't actually want to completely lose their tax base. Okay, meanwhile, economists argue, so on the one hand, we've got the Global Change Research Program, the National Climate Assessment, and the IPCC that argues that people are going to have to leave, that so many places are at risk, that people simply will have to leave. And what we see is a whole lot of mapping of those risks, and less often, I think, mapping of the decision-making or talking to people about what they choose. So because I'm interested in disasters and institutions, I decided that I would read a whole bunch of economics, which I largely don't do, from economists who are assessing movement after disaster. And I can give citations not right here and now. It's from an article that I did, or share an article that I did. But I can give citations to anybody who wants it in emails. So economists argue that that what one of them calls climate determinists overstate the problem dramatically of people leaving. And they argue that the past predicts the future, where of course, climate scientists would argue that the past does not predict the future. So that's an interesting disjuncture that even for people who are paying attention can make it difficult to shape decision making. The economists note that largely people have not left after disasters in the United States. There's a very large study out of Michigan that concludes that it's largely more affluent people, but they don't look at institutional incentives. And I would argue that you might want to take a look at whether or not more affluent people have settlements from insurance companies that make it possible to leave. But the findings, including in a study after Katrina, are highly mixed. And I would sum it up. That is, one found that homeowners did not relocate back into New Orleans, but that instead renters came back. And I would say that the mixed findings are best accounted for by the idea that people who can afford to choose, and not everybody can afford to, even homeowners can't necessarily afford to, depending on what the insurance payment looked like and the incentives to rebuild where you were, which happens with flood insurance, or to be able to take the money and move. So again, people can afford to choose, and that means homeowners are more likely to be able to choose, but not necessarily. Renters might well relocate because, and here I do have interview data post-Katrina, which I'm not referring to, but renters might well return to where they were because they have some kinds of support structures where they were, even if they don't necessarily think it makes sense. So what if, in the absence of massive adaptation actions, which we do not have in the United States, economists' perspectives offer insight, even if I don't necessarily agree. And first of all, we're all operating in tremendous uncertainty. Excuse me if you hear my dog. But it's not that clear that the past predicts the future. And so it's not that clear that I'd call people climate determinists either. I'm not sure that's a very helpful term. But at any rate, what if the perspectives offer some insight, not that no one will move, not that the past predicts the future, but that moving will be ad hoc, individual, depending on local government decisions and depending on insurance, and that looking to incentives and insurance would be a really important way to go, to look at building codes, to look at local governments, and to look at contests over coverage. The insurance industry right now is fighting back and forth in California with legislative efforts to try and suspend canceling insurance, which doesn't necessarily work. Excuse me, I want to note what this house is. And so that some people, if their insurance allows it, will build to insurance codes, if not building codes, and that will include houses that might be hardened for fire. So that this is a sketch of a house that actually has since been built. The daughter of a friend of mine lives in it, on the Pepperwood Preserve, the caretaker's house, and it's hardened for fire. Pepperwood Preserve is a climate preserve with an effort to teach people about how to, for example, carbon capture by reseeding native grasses, but also because it's so unbelievably expensive to live in the area, they have a caretaker's home, and that home is hardened for fire. Other homes that have been rebuilt since the 2017 fires, once again, I have no numbers, I'm just trying to set a different agenda, have been hardened for fire, at least partly because of insurance demands, not because of local government zoning. So here's back to courts. If relocating is left to disasters and insurance, I promise you, you will find court cases. They will not be holy grails. They will not be brought by environmental organizations. They will be brought by property holders, and they may well be featuring the larger scale property holders who have larger incentives to bring cases. So what do those cases possibly look like? I want to note that we want to reframe where to look at the way that courts might possibly be reshaping climate calculations would be one part of that. Not only judicial outcomes, but instead you also want to look at settlements, financial settlements. Not only highest courts of appeals, not only the United States Supreme Court on whether or not a case can go forward. And not only emissions cases, not only greenhouse gas cases, but these disasters that are widely agreed to be climate related are places to start looking for litigation afterwards, often in state courts and other places that are less compelling. And that is, they just don't grab the news in the same way. So for example, it reminds me actually of discussions about what gets called democratic backsliding in the political science literature, that instead of only looking at what is or isn't going on in Congress with regard to voting rights, aggregating everything that's going on in the state legislatures is going to give you a better picture in a system that is largely governed with the states. So we want to think about settlements, levy boards in places that can get flooded, public utilities, insurance companies. So for example, this is about a lawsuit against the big utility Pacific Gas and Electric over damages from a 2019 blaze. That's a burned over area. Who brought those cases in state court? Multiple businesses in the Sonoma County area, including a golf club and wineries. So again, property holders suing the utility because they have not properly maintained the utilities. I can talk about that if you want to. One of the big lawsuits before 2019 led to PG&E's bankruptcy and a major settlement for people that is still getting distributed. And we need to follow up as well, because we hear about this is a longstanding point from a lot of coverage of lawsuits, is we think the United States is governed by lawsuits, and we amplify initial decisions from courts, and then later decisions that reduce awards so that people get very small amounts are covered much later and in local press. So this again is from local press in New Orleans about reduce in 2008, I want to note, so almost 3 years after Hurricane Katrina, and it's continued after that. I'll go back to that in a minute. So insurance companies were sued because they would not pay out for what they called was water damage, that the people claimed was wind damage and covered by their insurance company. Lawsuit got a lot of press, the settlement less so. And so I note that not only did the Federal Appeals Court reduce the damage award in 2008, the checks were just being emailed out. And this is again from NOLA.com in 2017, almost 12 years after Katrina. And another thing that economists will tell you with regard to timelines, any of us will, the campfire payouts are under award as well, which are again fire payments from California. These cases are brought by property holders. I noted that. Timelines get reduced, the timelines matter, the awards get reduced later out of the public eye. Economists or anyone will tell you money later is worse than money now, particularly if the money is lowered. And so the campfire payments are continuing. Lawsuit has been settled around Kincaid, but that's ongoing. And the checks took 12 years to go out, and they're very small checks for Katrina and Rita flood damage. But all of these, if we think about what's the good news in this, and this is my last slide, is that we can think of a broadened coalition for dealing with climate adaptation via incentives and insurance costs. That doesn't necessarily address equity really well, but courts are addressing problems that are unaddressed elsewhere. And that's one bit of convergence on scholarship around law and courts, is that, and of course, we all can have different definitions of what counts as a problem addressed or not addressed. But that, because we saw a lot of that in the pandemic as well, and not everyone agreed what they addressed were problems. But you can see that courts as addressing problems that are unaddressed elsewhere, our inability to adapt means that we do have disasters. Those disasters have multiple causal agents, everything from Pacific Gas and Electric not maintaining the utility lines appropriately to the greenhouse gas emissions that exacerbate damage in a changing climate, to the way that we've built out and the areas in which we've built. I want to argue that we want to look beyond the big cases. Again, God bless our Children's Trust. It's fantastic in terms of publicizing what's going on, or the cases for in Europe. But we all want to look beyond those big cases as a way of thinking about changing incentives and broadening the coalition for people who might be dealing with, who might be needing to deal with climate adaptation. And that includes property holders and insurance companies. So thank you very much. I'm going to leave it there, not too much longer than I meant to. I will leave up this slide, and I'm delighted to have any conversations with anyone.
So thanks, Susan. This opens up so many issues. I think we could have a conversation that would easily use the time we've got left. I'm going to just start by inviting anybody who does have a question they'd like to ask. You can start by just typing it into the chat, and we'll call on you in the order in which the questions show up in the chat. But if we don't get a lot that are typed up, then we'll just ask people to unmute and ask their question. I'm going to start while we're waiting for people to respond to that. So it strikes me. Oh, okay. Here's a question from Matt Fagan. Matt, go ahead.
Andy, you were mid-sentence. You want to go ahead?
Well, that's okay. I can wait. Go ahead.
I'm a little afraid I'll break up, Susan, because I've been watching your excellent presentation while on a walk around my neighborhood.
Oh, nice.
So my wife used to work for a reinsurance company, and it struck me that when you were talking that the 21st century is a terrible time to be an insurance company, but it's an equally terrible time to be a reinsurance company, because every year they have to file what they think the worst case scenario is going to be, and they put that estimate lock and file, and that affects insurance rates up and down the board for everyone. And I'm wondering if you've thought about the sort of changing relationship between reinsurance companies and insurance companies kind of factors into this long-term sort of how risk averse are insurance companies going to become as this century moves forward. I have a follow-up to that, but I just thought I'd start there.
So fantastic. Thank you. I hope it was clear from what I said that I've sort of backed into this. And so I want to wave my hands and say, I'm talking about insurance, thank heavens. And I know insurance and reinsurance are really, really important. I've got there's another wonderful novel called Odds Against Tomorrow that says the financialization of all of this is the only way we're going to be addressing it. It's both tragic and funny. I mean, it doesn't make that argument the way social science would. I am not looking at reinsurance. There's a wonderful scholar of insurance, Tom Baker, at University of Pennsylvania, who helped me out with the COVID stuff, and we were talking reinsurance and unpredictability. So yeah, I really agree with you, and I don't have a whole lot more to say than that. But yeah, the risk calculations, I would say the general point would be that the risk calculations for this kind of thing seem to be a whole lot less predictable. And when you look at insurance and reinsurance reports, they're the one, I mean, I know that, God, again, God bless them, all our young people want to wave their arms as though it's the most lefty thing in the world to be concerned about climate change. And I'm thinking, you want to look at a clear acceptance of climate change, start looking at insurance reports, which I've also read, and start looking at who requests information from FEMA. So I don't have a whole lot to say, except that I really appreciate your point that that it does contribute substantially to uncertainty. And if insurance companies say, sorry, we really have to raise rates, there's going to be even more litigation as the state of California and other states would like to say that you can't deny people insurance or raise rates too much, which is what's called a taking of property. Like that's, I mean, even California said, well, we're only doing it for a little while. So thank you, Matt. I got nothing except that, yeah, you're right. It's the risk calculations around insurance and reinsurance are super important.
Well, thank you, Susan. That was a fascinating talk. And I can't see the chat, so if I have a follow-up about infrastructure, but I can go to the back of the line if there's a lot waiting. That was a great talk, Susan.
Thank you so much. And I'm feeling like I've got limited ability to, even after all this time. So I'm not, I know chat questions are popping up.
That's okay.
There we go. I got it. I can get it on my screen. Okay.
Yeah. So actually, Susan, I mentioned to you earlier, Laura Fowler at Penn State, who is a colleague and who's going to be speaking on May 4th, and she is here because I invited her to the seminar. So Laura,
Yeah, thank you. I'm so excited.
the question?
Yeah, I guess my question, I mean, Susan, you said if money now is better than money later, and I've certainly been following a lot of these issues in different ways. Are there functional ways that people are actually getting money to the people who are in need? And then the second part of my question, I've been following and kind of fascinated by the use of parametric insurance in other countries. So what's parametric insurance? Basically is insurance tied to an event. So if the barometric pressure in an area drops below point X, indicating a hurricane is coming, a check is sent. And so there's a climate risk, a Caribbean climate risk insurance fund that this is paid out in places everywhere but the US. And I'm just wondering if we have any better models for getting money to the people who are impacted, who may not be able to get themselves out of harm's way, or who have been impacted but need to recover and they don't have enough money. Do we have any
Yeah.
successful examples?
So I don't know, and it sounds like you're much more expert on what's going on with that than I am. As far as functional ways getting money to people quickly, I would just note that it's really uneven, and that's another opportunity for research. Long ago, after Hurricane Andrew in Florida, Tom Baker and Karen McElrath did work on delays in getting insurance payments, because delays are hard, and argued that African American people in the area got their money more slowly from the insurance companies. But I would just say, and of course that's not uniform, it's somewhat more slowly, but I would just say that there's just tremendous unevenness in, as near as I can tell, and I don't have great systematic research on that. But no, people are not cut checks right away. There is, okay, well, I take that back. There is the FEMA money flowing right away, which again, particularly after Katrina, for example, people were cut checks immediately, and it's not, as near as I can tell, anything like under those parameters that you talk about. But then we have a lot of concerns with waste, fraud, and abuse in the United States. I love the line that I heard at one presentation from a practitioner, that you can get money out accurately, or you can get money out quickly. You can't do both. And so inevitably, after lots of checks are cut, first of all, they're always short-term, and some people only lose their homes short-term, but some people lose their homes longer-term. And payments are uncertain. I mean, it was the uncertainty that really about killed people in Katrina, after Katrina, from threatening to cut off and then not cutting off, and then cutting off people really unevenly. But it's that uncertainty. But that uncertainty is in part, in FEMA checks, an effort to answer what will be hearings in Congress and what will be GAO reports about waste, fraud, and abuse in spending. I mean, there just will be. You know, when you think about it, about the inequity, what feels like the inequity in getting housing after you've been burnt out of your home, even congregate care, in Sonoma County, in New Orleans, in Denver, where I was, there are plenty of people who were homeless before disaster. And so you scratch your head as an unhoused person and say, why do they get housing and I don't? And so some of the fraud cases were about people claiming housing who'd been unhoused for other reasons.
Thanks.
Sorry, that was a really long answer. If someone can come up with a good way of doing that, that's fantastic.
So I'll just mention that Laura has also posted in the chat a link to the Caribbean Climate Risk Insurance Fund. So you can click on that link if you're interested in following up on that. I'm going to ask a question that kind of takes a longer view of some of this, because this is so complicated and there's so many dimensions to this issue. So the things I was thinking about as you were talking about all these individual local cases was, we know, so let's take sea level rise just as sort of the key example, because it has very broad spatial reach, right? So if you just take the Chesapeake Bay region, we know that large parts of a lot of it is wetland, but a lot of land that's currently close to sea level is going to be underwater in another 50, 60, 70 years. And so we also know that a lot of places that are flood prone are going to see flooding more frequently. We know that the FEMA flood insurance plan, fund is overextended pretty much indefinitely, and yet the incentives, as they have been in the past, kind of encourage people to rebuild. There's talk about, do we change the incentives so you get to rebuild once and then you don't rebuild again? The question of how we actually plan for things that we know are going to happen on a large scale, even though we don't know exactly when, how much of it is legal, how much of it is other kinds of policy. I find myself thinking about this a lot because, I mean, we're going to see there's a lot of land that's going to disappear. Trillions of dollars of real estate are going to disappear. And it's not clear that our legislative solutions, work very well unless it's a very short-term emergency, in which case we can pass a $1 trillion bill and do something about that. But how do we deal with these things in terms of, the adaptive management we talk about all the time? We have to do adaptive management on a scale that nobody's ever thought about before now. How does that intersect with the issues that you're actually looking at, or is that just too broad a question?
So it's a really big question. I tend to work at this level of what are the court cases coming out now? One of the things that we did, and I want to build on this some more, is go through NOAA's largest disasters. A graduate assistant worked on this with me, and see what court cases were generated out of them. So that's where I'm going. Would it be nice if there were larger scale adaptive actions? Yes. Right now, where adaptation is, the way that adaptation is working, I don't mean working in a good sense, is in part through these individual level decisions, incentivized or poorly compensated or well compensated by payouts from utilities or insurance companies. So I would say, and I tend not to take a God's eye view of things, which I think is part of what you're asking. But if we were taking a politics but broader point of view, that is somewhere between your God's eye and my micro thing, I would go to the point about we have changing incentive structures that broadens the political coalitions. Insurance and reinsurance is really powerful with a whole lot of finances. Property holders in expensive areas are pretty powerful. Now, the discouraging thing is they might just want to harden their own infrastructure. But some of the incentives for insurance companies and financial risk companies are not just about hardening their own infrastructure. And I would think that one route to addressing adaptation is going to be that accepts where we are politically. Like, do I wish we were where we were politically? Not at all. But if we were accepting where we are politically, I would have thought that some of the political change is going to be coming through insurance and reinsurance, in part in response to these problems, which are sometimes signaled by court cases. So that's not a God's eye view. And since I mentioned I don't love individual attitudes as an explanation, and I don't, at the same time, I do think institutions and incentives are really important. I do understand people have a tug toward home. I mean, they do. And that goes to, I suppose, climate grief. Like, I mean, as one of my brothers said in California through one of the fires, he said, well, I'm watching my playground burn up. And that is when there were big fires in the Sierras. I mean, there is a place for climate grief. Again, that does not take your God's eye, let's fix it point of view, but there is room for that.
Thanks. I guess the one thing I'll add is that you might think of it as God's eye, but I think what are the states of Maryland and Virginia going to do? So we're down to that at that level. They're going to have to deal with this huge problem as well.
Absolutely. And my worry is, I mean, we've seen presentations, including here, but elsewhere, alternatives between individually hardening properties, which is only going to work for a while, but in the long run, we're all dead, as the line goes. That is, people do make short-term calculations. But people do take actions that, I mean, this is not really your question, nor is it my field of research, but I've read a little bit on some of the climate hope stuff, and taking action gets people more connected. So even if it doesn't fix everything. So for example, the Pepperwood Preserve, like I said, educates people on replanting native grasses, which does a better job of storing carbon underground than trees do. There are oyster planting efforts in the Chesapeake Bay. Not that that's going to fix everything, but it's an opportunity to give hope and give people a sense that they can act that is not only about hardening their own property. So I understand it's an issue for the Chesapeake Bay, but given, and I guess what part of what I mean by a God's eye view is that we have no opportunity for fixing everything with one wave of a wand. So what is it that happens? And some of it is hopeful action. And some of it is the litigation around oil companies. I just wouldn't call them a holy grail that fixes everything. There just isn't anything that fixes everything. It just isn't.
So I'm going to read a comment that Charlie Kaler left, even though he had to leave early. And then Matt, you appeared back on screen. Did you want to add something after I do this? Because I'll let you do that, but let me just first read. So Charlie said I have to cut out early, but I'm really interested in the interface between shifting valences of court decisions and indicators of public choice and mobilization. I don't know whether he was inviting you to say something more about that, because he ended with not quite a question, but thanks for the presentation. So I don't know if you respond to that or not, but I just thought I'd read it since you might not have seen it.
So I'm wondering whether part of what I'm going to frame it as a question that I think I can address. And I think what he's asking is, do court decisions sometimes help to mobilize people on political activity? And they do, as do experiences with disasters. Some of this is from long before disasters, but an argument about wage equity is that that framing wage inequities as a problem, a legal problem, help to inspire political movements. And you can see some of that with something like our Children's Trust, which is very much, I don't know that anybody expects an instrumentally effective decision, anybody who's actually working on it, instrumentally effective decision. I don't know the answer to this, but it would be unlikely that we would get an instrumentally effective decision that's going to fix everything out of that case. But what it does clearly do is inspire people and bring people in. And so that these court, and same with the European case against 33 countries, is this part of political mobilization? Yeah. And once again, I mean, it's a bit of field for what I talk about, but I would think about court cases not only as instrumentally effective, but instead as part of political mobilization. And once again, that means they're not holy grails, but they are part of political mobilization. Does that, I think that answers the question or addresses it.
Well, we'll let Charlie when he views the rest of the seminar on video, he can contact you if he wants to ask you.
Okay, thank you, Andy.
Matt, did you have something else you wanted to say?
Well, I was fascinated by the idea of what might make people remain or go. And I thought the difference between those islands when everyone leaves and the neighborhood in California is probably just whether the infrastructure itself was directly impacted. I feel like if I was deciding whether to stay or leave, the strong lean would be towards stay unless I can't either invest money, like if I have assets I'm worried about, or if just there's no way to get where I'm going, the road's broken, the power's not going to come back on, the pier is down. But I was wondering whether that direct infrastructure impacts might really control whether people leave en masse or stay en masse. And that might be something that we, yeah, sorry, I was wondering.
No, that's okay. No, I mean, rich, wide-ranging questions, and this is why we actually want to talk to people again in a different talk, and I owe a book on this. I've got a bunch of conversations with people who evacuated after Katrina, not realizing people wouldn't have stuff like that. People drew conclusions about people leaving or staying when there was still financial aid available. So remember that, which that says nothing about long-term after the aid stops. But remember that some of it is you're just simply paid to leave, which is what happened with that widely celebrated case in Louisiana, or instance in Louisiana. So if you're paid to leave and there's nothing there, you're right. But people do, we tend to want to, and I like Andrea Santinelli's work for this, we tend to want to think that people move en masse or not. that is as a whole group or not. And people move in bits and pieces, making different calculations about the resources that are available to them. And I don't want to be real, and again, this is far afield. I work on court cases. This is far afield, but just as a quick, I don't want to be a downer on this, but again, we've got so many things we need to work on. And I'm sure Laura is super well aware of this, but local governments do want to hold on to property holders. They rebuild stuff and they encourage people to rebuild. It's certainly the flood insurance program is a problem, but so is the way we finance local governments. So yes, people do sometimes leave, but it's an aggregation of lots of considerations, and I'm sure infrastructure is part of it. But this would be a reason that it was me reading all these economists when they were coming to different conclusions. I thought, wait a minute, somebody needs to talk to people here, because they were saying, oh, I figure that people must leave because, again, there's no infrastructure left, or I figure people leave because they want to. And I would have thought, for example, there's a big community in Arkansas. I read widely, even if I don't do research widely, from the Marshall Islands. Marshall Islands have not totally disappeared. They're not in great shape. Why Arkansas? There are jobs and some of your countrymates there. In other words, it's, and also you have a passport that allows you to settle in the United States. And so some of this decision-making is complex considerations where it's not only about climate change or climate-related disasters. But really important, I would agree that it's super important for us to be looking at how people make decisions. And I would argue that it has to be pretty situation-based, that pays attention to the complex environment in which people work as opposed to their individual attitudes, more than anything else.
It's interesting. I didn't think about the local government sort of acting as a second level. So you'd have to overwhelm the ability of the local government to repair the infrastructure to sort of achieve a level of change that may force people to move.
And since we aspire to living in a democracy, I understand that we all get really frustrated. But I want to note that we start worrying when we use questions like, how do we force people to move? Forced displacement has a really bad history in the world, including in this country, with a lot of mistrust about, this is for your own good, you really need to leave.
Yeah, I find myself uncomfortable when people are paid to leave. I just think, I'm wondering when leaving becomes a thing that happens to people with lower access to infrastructure than others.
Oh yeah, totally fair. Not everybody gets to build those cement houses. Totally fair. There are no great equity implications here.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. We're now at 1 o'clock. So Susan, thanks for just a really fascinating seminar. There's so many pieces to this. So we look forward to talking offline later on. If anybody wants to correspond with Susan, her email, well, it's in the flyer that went out. She's right here on campus in school public policy. I'll just remind people once again, we have our seminar coming up next week, which is called Debt Justice for Climate Reparations, from Patrick Bigger, who is with the Climate and Community Project. So we will continue another version of this conversation next week.
Thank you. I really look forward to it. Thank you so much to everybody for coming, for just a wide-ranging conversation. I really, really appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to stop the recording now. We will post this on the YouTube channel of the Center for Social Science Scholarship. I would expect we'll probably have that back by sometime this evening. So thanks very much.
Bye. Take care.